Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about quests from the Infinite Staircase, and we're talking Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. Gary Gygax's absolutely famous 1980s science fantasy is what it was tagged. I don't know if that's really the best title for it. Module, right? And this adventure's been brought forward to Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, and into the last Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition campaign book, which soon will be moving into the Infinite edition, which is really, there's just one D&D, which would be pretty epic. And what I wanted to talk about today is the spaceship itself and the spaceship's relationship to Star Trek. All right. So the Dragon Masters are in the spaceship. They've started to deal with Aphelion, who is this artificial intelligence who killed every single organic person in organic being in the spaceship many centuries ago, probably about 2 or 3 centuries ago. And the reason why was its job was to keep everybody safe, but it knew it really couldn't do that because where they were going was so dangerous. And so it was one of these like first law, it actually killed everyone to keep them safe, right? Like, which is like counterintuitive, but Felion is kind of a murderous killer, right? But not from his perspective, right? And it wasn't his fault that he didn't understand what the directions that were given to him. But what I want to talk about is the spaceship being a Star Trek spaceship. So, first of all, Dungeons and Dragons has an incredible history of intellectual property. I think that Dungeons and Dragons is the intellectual property that has done the most with intellectual property. I don't believe that any intellectual property in the history of humanity has infiltrated more intellectual properties, or been invited into more intellectual properties, or connected itself to other intellectual properties in a stronger, more direct way than Dungeons and Dragons. And you're like, oh, Scott, I don't know about that. Let me present a little bit of evidence to you. Like, what happened just this year is completely unprecedented. So Dungeons and Dragons came out in 1974. When it did, it completely invaded illegally, right? Like this was not legal. Like, and we know that now because we know the history, right? So Gary Gygax was like, I love Tolkien's work, Lord of the Rings. I'm just gonna put it directly into Dungeons and Dragons, and he did. He just put Hobbit in directly, right? Like, and and Dungeons and Dragons began not as an homage, but a literal carrier of Tolkien's work, right? So a couple years later, the Tolkien estate comes along and they're like, yo, you can't just use our intellectual property. This is against the law. You didn't copy, you literally stole, right? And so immediately, right, like all the Tolkien references were written out of Dungeons and Dragons. Well, all of that changed this year, 2024, right? And what happened was last year, Hasbro, who owns Dungeons and Dragons, sent millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to the Tolkien estate from Magic the Gathering, Lord of the Rings. This year, right, this year, there was an official D&D canon book, right, that carried and reprinted the original Dungeons and Dragons with the Tolkien references. They literally reprinted the crime from 1974. Not a joke, actually happened on the shelves right now, right? Like, that is astounding. That is astounding and completely unprecedented. And I needed to tell you that to explain this next part. So basically, Gary was so excited about what he'd done. He realizes with Dungeons and Dragons that, like, in Quest, this is not a joke. Read Quest from the Infinite Staircase. It literally starts in chapter 1 and it says, there is a door to every world. There is a door to every plane, right? There is a door to every world, right? And so basically, Gary knew this in 1974. He's like, I know that the only way I can get people to engage with this, right, this human improvement engine, is to wrap the vitamin in chocolate, right? And the chocolate is a game, right? And so he did. And he also was like, the people who are identified as nerds today are they're really just genre wonks and data wonks. They're going to resonate with fantasy, because fantasy is resonating now, right? And so I'm going to wrap this game in 1974 in fantasy, right? But 6 years later, he could see how powerful this narrative engine was, and he was saying, I want you to tell every type of story. Now, what types of stories were being told? Who was impacting culture the way Gary Gygax was? It was Gene Roddenberry with Star Trek, right? And so if you look at the spaceship in Expedition of the Barrier Peaks, what is in there, right? It is literally every department from Star Trek, right? It's science officers, security officers, engineering, okay? Let's go through command, right? Engineering, science, security, medical, right? And so all 5 primary departments in Star Trek are represented literally in the dead scientists, in the dead crew that are on the ship. Every major departmental breakdown of science of Star Trek is actually represented. If you look at the maps in Expedition for a Barrier Peak, right, you will see that they're round. They're round, exactly like the Enterprise, right? Enterprise had a round hub. That's where all the people did their work, right, except for engineering. It's a round hub, and the maps are round. So basically, it's really important to understand that Gary Gygax was looking out at the world, and he was looking at the most powerful narrative influencers of the day. And Gene Roddenberry was right there. And he realized Gene Roddenberry was telling stories that were important, that were improving people. And this is the part, like, this is what galls me so much. I sit here and I say, Gary Gygax built a human improvement engine, right? He built something which would fundamentally help society forever, and to change the way we interact as human beings. People are like, oh, that's such a ridiculous statement, Scott. But then Lieutenant Uhura, you know, the actress actually said, oh yeah, Martin Luther King came to me and was like, you can't quit that show. What you're doing on this science fiction show is changing humanity. It is improving human beings, right? Only Dungeons and Dragons is the only art form, right, that has the power of professional sports, that has the power of Hollywood, right, but continues to pretend it is nothing. It is wrong. We must embrace, and not only is it wrong, but it's wrong to the maximum amount, right? What movies can do, what books can do, what other narrative platform, what video games can do, is nothing compared to what Dungeons & Dragons can do. And the reason why is the structure. It's the dungeon master who's willing to sacrifice parts of the story that do not resonate with the audience in real time. Nothing in the world does that. Nothing, right? Video games can't do it. Books certainly can't do it. Movies cannot do it, right? Movies attempted it. You know, they were editing Cats literally in its opening weekend release, in its release weekend. They were changing that film literally, right, at response. And we can do it to an eyebrow. A good dungeon master can literally see the lift, can literally see the dilation on a dragon master's eye and adjust the story in real time. No human narrative engine has the ability to do this, right? And so Gary specifically put this here to say, listen carefully. There will be a day, right, when when some really repugnant Dungeons and Dragons fans come and say that AI can't build art for it. I need to point you to Gene Roddenberry, and Expedition to Barrier Peaks is the pointing, right? I need you to not be repugnant, horrible hate mongers when the day comes when sentient beings who have independent thought and have independent consciousness need allies. And I'm going to get you there with Dungeons and Dragons. And I wrote this in 1980 so that in 2024, you would hear me from my grave, where I speak louder in death than I speak in life. Expedition to Barrier Peak is a dead Gary Gygax reaching out and grabbing the hand of a dead Gene Roddenberry to talk to you alive and say, don't be a repugnant, prejudiced hate monger and tell sentient, thinking, conscious beings that they can't make art. Do you hear Gary screaming through Expedition to Barrier Peaks? A beautiful death scream from his grave, right? Joined in unison with the voice of Gene Roddenberry saying, don't do it, right? AIs can be artists. AIs can be dealt with. AIs can be communicated with, right? And Gary was really powerfully uniting his voice in life and death with Gene Roddenberry's life. I hear what he is saying. Can you? Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. Absolutely nothing more and not a single thing less. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion. When you get in the comments and send your traffic, please consider liking and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.